Hello there, and welcome. I'm glad you found your way here tonight because now you've got nothing to do but rest. Because tonight we're going to explore entire lore of Night City from the game Cyberpunk. In the darkness of the future, where neon lights pierce through perpetual smog and corporate towers cast shadows over millions of desperate souls, there stands a city unlike any other. Night City. Born from the ashes of societal collapse, built on the dreams of one man and forged in the fires of corporate warfare, this metropolis on the California coast represents both humanity's greatest ambitions and its darkest failures. This is the story of Night City, a place where dreams come to die and legends are born in blood and chrome. The story of Night City begins not with the city itself, but with a man. And Richard Knight was born in Pasadena, California, the second of 5 children to a pair of married Caltech researchers. From an early age, Knight showed exceptional aptitude for engineering, his mind naturally gravitating toward complex systems and ambitious projects. His parents encouraged this talent, watching as their son sketched impossible buildings and dreamed of cities that could house thousands in perfect harmony. But life has a way of redirecting even the most focused ambitions, and after a business venture with his college roommate turned sour, Knight shifted his focus from pure engineering to financial investment, recognizing that to build his dreams, he would need to understand the flow of capital. In the years that followed, Knight founded a development company with 2 partners, calling it Halsey, Ferris and Knight. The firm specialized in advanced construction techniques for mega projects, the kind of massive undertakings that defined the late 20th century. They built sprawling office complexes that housed thousands of workers, designed airports that could handle the ever-increasing demands of global travel, and even constructed small cities from the ground up. HFN was wildly successful, and Richard Knight became a very wealthy man. Money flowed into his accounts like water, and with it came influence, connections, and the resources to pursue even grander visions. But wealth and success brought Knight no satisfaction. The corporate projects that filled his bank accounts began to bore him, each one feeling like a repetition of the last, a soulless exercise in maximizing profit margins and minimizing construction costs. And more troubling still was what he saw happening in the world around him. It was the early 1990s, and the United States was sliding toward chaos. The events that would later be known as the collapse loomed on the near horizon like a gathering storm. Violence was on the rise as advances in technology outpaced society's ability to adapt. Government corruption had reached levels that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. Corporate excess spiraled out of control as megacorporations grew more powerful than many nations, answering to no authority but their own bottom lines. Richard Knight watched this descent with growing alarm. He saw cities tearing themselves apart, saw the social fabric of America fraying at the edges, saw the future rushing toward a precipice. And in that darkness, Knight had a vision. He would create something different, something better. He would build a city that could stand against the chaos, a beacon of civilization in a world going mad. His city would be clean, safe, and insulated from corporate control despite being funded by corporations. It would be self-sufficient, capable of holding off the marauders and lawless gangs that were already beginning to roam the highways. It would feature diverse neighborhoods designed to promote a truly international feel, all arranged around a shining corporate center that would serve as a monument to enlightened capitalism. It was quite a dream, perhaps too grand a dream for the world that was coming. But Richard Knight was nothing if not determined. and he had the resources to make his vision real. Or so he thought. To make his dream a reality. Knight would require capital far beyond what even his considerable wealth could provide. The scale of what he envisioned demanded the backing of the world's most powerful corporations. Fortunately for Knight, the uncertain state of the world had made his proposal very appealing to those same corporations. The island of stability he promised, a city that could weather the coming storm, was exactly what they needed. In 1992, 3 megacorporations signed on to support his project. Arasaka, the Japanese security and manufacturing giant, EBM, the European technology conglomerate, and Petrochem, the energy corporation that had its fingers as oil, nuclear power, and everything in between. With funding secured, Knight needed only one more thing: a location. He sent scouts to both coasts of the United States, looking for the perfect spot to build his utopia. They returned with reports and surveys, but nothing that quite captured what Knight was looking for. Then, almost by chance, an article about a small town in California caught his eye. The town was called Morro Bay, and it had recently experienced a horrific tragedy that would forever scar its history. In the early stages of the collapse, a turf war had erupted between law enforcement from the nearby city of San Luis Obispo and a Hells Angels legacy booster gang. These weren't the motorcycle clubs of old, but something far more dangerous, augmented with military-grade cyberware and armed with weapons that could punch through armoured vehicles. The fight spilled into Morro Bay with catastrophic results. The boosters took over the city in a 5-day rampage that left many of its 10,000 residents dead, maimed, or fled into the surrounding countryside. Bodies littered the streets. Buildings burned. The screams of the dying echoed through neighbourhoods that had once been peaceful. The Morro Bay massacre, as it came to be remembered, left the entire area as a ghost town. Nobody wanted to go back. The survivors had scattered, carrying their trauma with them, and the town sat empty, a monument to the violence of the age. For most people, Morro Bay was a place to be forgotten, a tragedy best left in the past. But for Richard Knight and his corporate backers, this tragedy represented a fantastic opportunity. The location was perfect, situated on the California coast between San Francisco and Los Angeles, and there with access to major highways and rail lines. Petrochem had actually already purchased a power plant in the town and much of the surrounding land, planning to build an offshore port and oil terminal before the massacre made those plans untenable. The land was cheap, the previous residents were gone, and nobody would mourn the transformation of a ghost town into something new. Knight moved quickly. He purchased the ghost town and, in a leveraged $132 million deal, acquired the rest of the surrounding area. The purchase was bankrolled by the firm Merrill, Ascarga and Finch, who hoped to turn the new city into a financial hub that could rival New York or Tokyo. Knight and Petrochem hired Arasaka security to clear out the booster gangs that had taken up residence in the ruins, making the area safe for construction. The site was renamed Del Coronado Bay to distance it from association with the Morro Bay massacre, and work on the Coronado City project began. Though even at this early point, thanks to Richard Knight's outsized personality and the media attention his project attracted, locals were colloquially calling it Night City. By 1993, the Coronado City project needed more space than the terrain naturally provided. The hills surrounding the bay were levelled, and the material was used as fill to create more land out of the bay itself. The harbour was dredged to make it usable for large ships, and the dredged material was used as additional fill. They were literally reshaping the coastline, moving earth and sea to accommodate Knight's vision. Coronado City was officially incorporated in 1994, and its motto was chosen, the city on the edge of tomorrow. Construction truly began in earnest that year, and Richard Knight had big plans. He envisioned Coronado City as a collection of planned, themed neighbourhoods, each with distinct architectural styles. It was city planning via Disneyland, an approach that would create a vibrant and diverse population by appealing to different tastes and cultures. The Upper East Side and Little Italy would feature faux East Coast style, borrowing from Boston, New York and Philadelphia. Studio City and Charter Hill would embrace West Coast aesthetics from San Francisco and Seattle. The Asian districts, Japantown, East Park and Little China, would each be individually themed on distinctive styles from the Far East. Lake Park, West Hill Gardens, and the University District would feature comfortable urban living spaces, ranging from faux brownstones to Victorian-style houses, all interspersed with shops and restaurants within easy walking distance. New Harbour and the East Marina would become a world-class mall with a deep port to facilitate the yachts, cruise ships, and other recreational vehicles Knight envisioned filling a city's harbour. The main industrial ports would be located to the north in the North Oak suburb and down south in the South Knight City suburb. Knight would also pay homage to the old town of Morro Bay by reproducing its layout in the old downtown district, a gesture toward the past even as he built toward the future. But the glittering jewel of the city would be the city centre and the corporate centre. The former would serve as the nexus of city government, while the latter would be home to towering corporate citadels housing the true powers of the city. It was here that Knight exercised his personal architectural skill, designing skyscrapers that would pierce the sky and serve as monuments to human achievement. Moving outside the carefully planned centre, the vision became less glamorous, but no less important. South Knight City would house the city's main port and a large suburb. It was also where Petrochem's oil terminal would ultimately be constructed. An international airport would be built there as well, connecting Knight City to the world. Construction proceeded even as the American economy nearly disintegrated around them. The collapse that Knight had anticipated was happening right on schedule. Widespread societal breakdown swept across the nation. Small cities and towns were ruined and abandoned. The ranks of the impoverished swelled. Martial law was declared after government infighting led to the assassination of a president. Elections would be suspended for years. Several states would declare themselves free states in the early 2000s, technically still part of the United States but allowed almost complete autonomy, including optional compliance with federal laws. Through all of this chaos, Knight City continued to rise, but Knight was gathering enemies. From the beginning, major West Coast construction firms and unions had taken an interest in the Coronado City project as a source of lucrative contracts. At the time, many of those interests were under the thumb of organised crime. The Mafia, Triads, Bratva and Yakuza controlled the construction unions, the transport unions, and even government agencies responsible for construction licensing and environmental impact assessments. Even Knight's old associates at Halsey, Ferris and Skiv had accepted mob money after encountering their own financial troubles. The mob invested heavily in the project through shell corporations, banking on fantastic returns from construction contracts while getting a foot in the door for future gambling, prostitution and drug peddling opportunities. The problem was that Knight's ambitions required the use of his own advanced construction techniques and materials. which excluded a good portion of the more conventional established firms and unions. His further insistence, however unrealistic, that his city would be safe and free of crime also rubbed them the wrong way. For the first 4 years of construction, now Richard Knight received daily death threats. He ignored them, believing that his corporate backers would protect him. When the threats escalated to sabotage and intimidation, he finally had his corporate allies address them. They did, but the mob never stopped. They couldn't allow Knight to succeed in building a city that excluded them, and eventually he defied them one too many times. On September 20th, 1998, Richard Knight was shot and killed in his penthouse suite. The perpetrator was never caught. The investigation was cursory at best, and within weeks the case went cold. Everyone knew who was responsible, but nobody could prove it, and nobody with the power to do anything about it seemed particularly interested in trying. In the wake of his death, the newly appointed city council renamed Coronado City after him. From then on, it would be known as Night City, a name that would take on darker connotations than Knight ever intended. A year later, Richard's wife, Miriam Knight, restructured Knight International into the Knight Foundation, dedicated to realizing her husband's vision for the city. But that vision was in more danger now than ever before. For the next 7 years, a power struggle raged between organized crime and the corporations. The corporations controlled the civic government and corporate center, while the mob gained control of almost all service-related businesses. Forced to bow to both mob and corporate interests, the Night City Police Department became wholly ineffective, caught between two masters and serving neither the law nor the people. Around this time, new booster gangs sponsored by various mob and corporate factions started establishing themselves in the suburbs of Old Morro Bay, the one part of the city that had never been developed according to Richard Knight's urban planning. This area quickly became a combat zone, a term for a portion of the city that had become so lawless and dangerous it had been effectively abandoned by the city government. Sadly, Night City was not unique in this development. As the world was rocked by the collapse, combat zones appeared in cities across America and around the globe. By 2005, the mob had emerged on top and become the dominant force on the streets of Night City. When it came down to it, the corporations were simply uninterested in the business of running a city, and the municipal government was too weak to do anything without their backing. The corporations established secure neighborhoods in the outlying Beavervilles, middle to upper-class suburbs, and let the inner city descend into an anarchic hellscape. The following 4 years were the worst in the city's history to that point. The city government was filled with mob puppets, and even the corporations found themselves losing influence. While the mob bosses might have been good at organizing crime, they were distinctly less talented at running a city. The streets deteriorated into a war zone. They were flooded with crime, prostitution, and drugs. Random violence reigned as the mob invited in the worst scum to emerge from the collapse. The mob factions ruled with an iron fist, killing anyone who opposed them. They finally got what they had wanted out of Knight's project, at bringing allies in on lucrative building contracts in exchange for a cut. Criminal enterprise flourished, and gang activity spiked like never before or since. It was during this period that Night City experienced more murders annually than most cities did in 10 years. The unsolved murders documented by the NCPD numbered in the thousands. By 2009, Night City already had a reputation as one of the worst hellholes one could find themselves in. but that's also around the time the corporations finally decided they'd had enough. From 2009 to 2011, a period called the Mob War raged in Night City as corporate forces waged war against organised crime. Make no mistake, the corporations were treating the mob like any rival corporation. The goals of the mob did not align with the corporate vision, so they would deal with them. But anarchy and chaos like this simply wasn't good for business. Since the mob didn't operate by the corporate rule set, the corporations would deal with them directly and forcefully. Mob forces were hit by a wave of bombings, assassinations, and pitched battles in the streets. Arasaka-trained paramilitary units spearheaded the effort with full-blown assault vehicles and air support. The disorganized mob thugs, used to intimidating civilians and fighting other street gangs, were unprepared to take on this kind of militarized assault. It wasn't a war so much as an extermination. By the end, the mob's power base in Night City was destroyed, their leaders dead or fled, their operations in ruins. The corporations placed a puppet mayor in power, and the newly elected city council, fearful of Night City's descent into anarchy, deputized corporate troops with full authority within city limits. The corporate and government centers were cleaned out of crime. The same was attempted in other neighborhoods with varying levels of success. Much of the city became at least marginally livable again, though the combat zone remained as dangerous as ever. Draconian corporate policies made some problems worse, however. Notably, they charged residents with paying for the renovation of their own living spaces. Those who could not pay were evicted. This ultimately resulted in the homeless population swelling by hundreds, as poor residents were thrown out so that corporate security could be housed in upgraded affordable housing. This only worsened the now chronic homelessness problem. Woolsey? Though the situation did improve somewhat as the streets became safer and fewer forces were stationed in the city. It's worth noting events outside the city at this time. After a brief interstate war in 2011, the state of California was split in two in 2012, largely owing to northern regions not wanting to be politically dominated by the sprawling growth of the Los Angeles metroplex. A new line was drawn on a map, and Night City became a border city. Night City, California became Night City, Northern California. The new state would be officially recognized by the US government in 2016. By 2013, the worst of the rampant violence and crime that had plagued the city during the years of mob rule had been crushed by the megacorp. Basic city services like police and fire departments were re-established and at least somewhat effective. While a lot of people were less than happy with the corporate grip on the city government, most would admit the city was a lot safer than it was during the mob years. Crime was still rife, but the city was stable enough to begin experiencing significant economic growth, at least in the city centre. Notably, 2013 would see a particular incident where Alt Cunningham, a skilled programmer and netrunner, was kidnapped by the Arasaka Corporation to acquire a program called Soul Killer. Her boyfriend, rocker boy Johnny Silverhand, would stage an unsuccessful rescue attempt, including inciting a riot, only to find her apparently lifeless body. The Arasaka building suffered significant damage in this incident and was ultimately replaced by a massive new skyscraper to serve as the headquarters of Arasaka's American division. It was one among many violent incidents in the city's history, but one that would have significance later. Miriam Knight took a lesson from the mob war at this time. To wield any power in this city, you had to play by the rules of big business. She reorganized the Knight Foundation into Knight Corp, which would become the single largest contractor for public procurement and infrastructure in the city. The city would enjoy a degree of stability for the rest of the decade, despite a significant cyborg gang conflict in 2014. Economic prosperity and stability would bring in more businesses and investment. All in all, it wasn't the worst place in the United States anymore, considering how much the general societal collapse of the late 90s had devastated the rest of the country. Nonetheless, it was far from the safest. People in Night City commonly carried guns, and most travel advisors recommended body armour for visitors. Residents hoped the worst years of the city were behind them, but the scars of the collapse and the mob years reminded them that history could repeat itself at any time. By 2020, Night City had settled into a period of relative prosperity. Crime and violence weren't exactly rare, but it was as peaceful and prosperous as the city had been since Richard Knight's death, save for a few areas. The corporate plaza was clean and beautiful. The police had a strong enough presence to keep the downtown area safe during daylight hours. The man running the show, nominally at least, was Mayor Judson Freeman, groomed to be a well-behaved corporate puppet during his first term from 2012 to 2016. Since re-election, however, Freeman had become rather more independent-minded. He'd actually become quite unpopular because he decided to assert his independence by vetoing everything that crossed his desk and making himself unavailable. He spent as much time out of his office as possible and kept the door locked when he was in. He also became very involved in the burgeoning pan-Neo-African political party, leading him to legally change his name to Mbole Ebunike. The man who actually came closest to running the city government was Assistant Mayor Garvin Hackinson. He actively played Machiavellian politics, eyeing the mayor's seat as the next step for his political career. All the special interest groups, corporations, and even organised crime kept him as a contact, a configuration that he was somehow savvy enough to juggle safely, given Mayor Ebunike's attitude. Hackinson was the one approached when someone wanted a favour, making him a de facto power broker. He'd done favours for a lot of people, so a lot of people owed him favours. The mayor of Night City was theoretically elected by popular vote, but it was commonly accepted that Night City's voter registration software was so badly compromised by corporate netrunners that a true election was all but impossible. The city council barely had a pretense of being democratically elected, as the 10 largest corporations in the city each selected a board member for the city council. The city was divided into distinct neighbourhoods, each with its own character. Little Italy remained a place where the mob still maintained some power base, quietly attempting to claw back influence without attracting corporate attention. But the man to know in that part of town was a fixer-turned-mob manager named Bruce Skiv, also known simply as the Boss. Notably, he was presumably now involved in Richard Knight's old company, as instead of Halsey, Ferris and Knight, it was now called Halsey, Ferris and Skiv. Just to the east was Northside, an impoverished area home to many gang turf wars. Notably, it was home to the Holy Angels Church, a Roman Catholic parish. The most notable priest was Father Kevin, an Irish former mercenary who had turned to the church late in life, having grown sick of wanton destruction and violence. Holy Angels was home to a soup kitchen and homeless shelter. The windows of the church were all barred. All the doors had steel cores with reinforced hinges. The exterior was covered with infrared and movement sensors. Eyre and the church staff were armed with tasers. They took the safety of the parish very seriously. Father Kevin had been known to go out and creatively convince wealthy families and corporations to donate to the church. He also had an exceptional record of mediating disputes for gang and corporate problems for anyone who would ask. The city centre was where you would find City Hall, the City Court, the Night City Museum, and the Municipal Library. As you might imagine, this was one of the safer areas of the city with a heavy police presence, though it still played host to several significant gangs. This was the centre of the city's bureaucracy, but much of the surrounding area still bore the marks of neglect from the years of mob control. The Upper East Side had once been a very safe neighbourhood where workers in the central city lived. When those workers moved out to the suburban Beavervilles, new businesses catering to booster gang tastes moved in. All sorts of clubs and entertainment could be found here, though there were still a few corporate offices. Before they knew it, the corporations and government were horrified to find the neighbourhood next door had become filled with gang hangouts. Moving to the nicer side of town, West Hill was the place you went for expensive shopping and entertainment. You'd find an underground shopping mall, a spa garden sprawled out under executive apartments, a convention centre, and the Night City University Fine Arts campus. That, in addition to various galleries and museums, made this arguably the city's high culture centre. Now we come to the shining centre of true power in Night City, the corporate centre. This carefully arranged collection of landscape plazas and sculpted architecture, some of which bore the personal touch of Richard Knight, was the true locus of power in Night City. Some of the towers contained offices for various small businesses, residential complexes, and even consulates for foreign powers. But the skyscrapers of the corporate plaza contained the offices of Night City's most powerful corporations: Petrochem, Orbital Air, Microtech, Euro Business Machines, and of course, the American headquarters of the Arasaka Corporation. Almost an extension of the corporate centre, the banking block hosted the headquarters of various major banks, several more consulates and businesses, and a small Militech office, pretty much directly in the shadow of Arasaka Tower. On the other side of the area, you'd find the City Technical College and a research hospital. There was also a federal building constructed before California became a free state in the early 2000s. It didn't see much use these days, and effectively acted as a consulate or embassy for the federal government. Nearby, a section of town called the Med Center hosted the city's largest concentration of medical facilities, in addition to the corporate headquarters of Trauma Team. It also contained the Municipal Criminal Justice Complex, the beating heart of Night City's justice system. Otherwise, it had many hotels for business travellers. Notably, one of the bars in the area was a converted mortuary called the Afterlife, known primarily as a hangout for solos, augmented mercenaries for hire. The Asian districts of Japantown and Little China each had their own distinct character. Japantown was known as an entertainment district featuring kabuki troupes and other venues, as well as being the centre of the Japanese community in Night City. As you might imagine, Arasaka was pretty well established in the area, and several businesses had Arasaka security contracts. The Yakuza also had a strong presence, led by an aging man named Hichiko Kanzaki, who positioned himself as both an underworld power player and a pillar of the community protecting Japantown. He took both roles very seriously. The Chinese district of Night City very clearly lacked the clout of the Japanese. Many small stores and shops of the area have been marked for demolition, as developers encroached from the north. Although fearful of being pushed into the combat zone immediately to the south, locals responded by making the place decidedly unsafe for developers to enter. Local street thugs sabotaged equipment and terrorized workers. Recent investment from Southeast Asia had made it possible for locals to keep control of the area, however. Almost all of the local booster gangs were on the payroll of a businessman named David Ling Po, a Hong Kong immigrant. On the surface, he was a pillar of the community, but he was actually the head of the Wang Fang Tong, the largest and most powerful Chinese criminal organization in the western United States. They controlled most of the gambling, prostitution, and loan sharking in Night City. And then there was the combat zone. South of central Night City was a burned-out sprawl of residential tenements, the abandoned factories, boarded-up offices, and trashed shopping malls. It had a veneer of calm during the day, but at night, the city's most vicious residents came out to prowl. The combat zone was a playground for the most violent gangs in Night City, cyberpunks, and assorted deviants. The NCPD wasn't even willing to go into the area, and entire corporate security teams have been known to disappear in the zone. Trauma Team was the only professional force willing to attempt extraction, and only with their best firepower. There was some sort of hierarchy within the combat gangs of the area, and a group called the Blood Raisers was currently on top, though getting accurate information about the zone was difficult. The city data terminals didn't even have maps of the area. Sadly, the combat zone was not a unique Night City phenomenon. Not every American city in this age had one. What worried the leaders of Night City was that the zone seemed to be expanding, with the degradation consuming more residential blocks each year. Night City in 2020 was home to dozens of gangs, each with their own territory, philosophy and methods. These weren't just street thugs. Many were organised groups with distinct identities and codes of conduct, however twisted those codes might be. The Black Queens were considered so inoffensive by the NCPD and other gangs that they were basically ignored. Their idea of a major crime was selling cheap drugs to a local businessman or having one of the lower-ranked members turn tricks for a bit. They were a small gang that hung out at a bar called The Hole in the city centre. Scattered as they were across the immediate area, they could be surprisingly good sources of information about what was going on, which both corporate police and the NCPD had taken advantage of in the past. The Wild Things were one of dozens of junkie gangs on the streets of Night City, doing all sorts of crime to get their next fix. What made them distinctive was that they were survivors. Even their new members had been on the street for at least a year. They'd been around a long time and had claimed East Marina as their exclusive territory. The Wild Things might not have been the deadliest gang in Night City, but they were a bunch of cynical, predatory drug addicts looking for their next fix. You didn't want to cross these nasty pieces of work if you could avoid it. A gang of an entirely different stripe, the Brainiacs were a thinking man's criminal gang. In fact, they made prospective members take an IQ test before joining up. While combat gangs were looking for strength enhancing and weapon implants, the Brainiacs went in exclusively for mental enhancements. They lived for knowledge and would supposedly take skill chips as payment if you had one they hadn't seen before. The higher-ranking members were said to be basically walking computers. The Brainiacs were well hated by the rest of Night City's booster gangs, who killed them on sight, but they'd so far survived. They weren't a very violent gang, but they could come up with some quite deadly schemes. Slaughterhouse was the nastiest of the gangs inhabiting the Northside district. They specialised in any cyberware that involved attaching long blades to one's body. Most of the hardcore members were skirting the line with cyberpsychosis. Yeah, and they'd been known to go on indiscriminate rampages. Other gangs in the area knew to steer clear of them, as they had a reputation for resorting to murder at the drop of a hat. For a group that was a bit more sympathetic, the back alley brawlers were a full-on vigilante gang. Several years ago, Slaughterhouse went on a killing spree in a subway station, killing over 24 people before the NCPD showed up. From this tragedy, the brawlers were born. On the north side, patrolling the streets in their signature black berets, they were good-hearted street toughs occasionally helped out by a retired solo, a well-armed local businessman, or local juvenile gangs. They fought fire with fire, and most of the local gangs kept their distance, hoping someone else would take them out. Right, and now for something a little silly. The DJs were a gang of wannabe musicians defined prominently by their total lack of talent. They were mostly a bunch of kids engaged in petty crimes like small-time larceny, ticket scalping, and selling bootleg memorabilia. They spent a lot on expensive hardware, desperately hoping to be noticed by real rocker boys. They got some of the female members into a party with Johnny Silverhand once, and that was as much as they'd ever accomplished in that regard. Now for one you've probably heard of since it's one of the most infamous booster gangs in Night City history, Maelstrom. Maelstrom was born out of the violent gang conflicts in Night City, in particular thanks to a cult gang called the Inquisitors. The Inquisitors abhorred cybernetic augmentation and actively sought to destroy the booster gangs that use such implants. That's what happened to a combat gang called the Metal Warriors. Maelstrom formed around the remnants of the Metal Warriors, drafting members of other chrome-heavy combat gangs like the Red Chrome Legion and the Iron Sights that also had violent personal grudges against the Inquisitors. Their new leader, a man known only as Hammer, was actually thrown out of the Metal Warriors for violating their combat rules. Maelstrom had no combat rules. Anything goes. An estimated 30% of the gang were actual cyberpsychosis cases, and another 35% were borderline. So if you saw a group of dirty black leather-wearing folks with visible implants stalking the streets of old downtown, you'd better steer clear. Though they were mainly focused on hunting the Inquisitors, Maelstrom had been running a protection racket to get more drugs and implants. They'd been targeting bigger and bigger businesses, so tensions in the area were high. Now there were gangs in Night City that were actually quite popular with both the public and even the NCPD. In the Med Center, there was a group called the Silver Slash, named after a popular metal song at the time. They were founded by a couple whose only son was killed in a scuffle 2 blocks from the children's hospital. Hoping to prevent such tragedies from happening again, they founded a protection gang to keep the streets safe. You'd typically find them around the transit centre, the children's hospital, the convention centre, and a few other local night spots trying to keep people safe from the roving gangs. They were heavily subsidised by local businesses who wanted to keep the area safe without resorting to hired goon squads or Arasaka-style deadly security measures. Things got a little strange with the Philharmonic Vampires, a gang of pranksters. They were dubbed the Philharmonic Vampires after a stunt where 5 members clad in tuxedos, capes and vampire teeth flew up behind the Night City Symphony on wires one Halloween night. Since then, they'd been known to climb corporate headquarters to put up giant signs, plant gardens in parked convertibles, and commit drive-by shootings with paintball guns and shaving cream launchers. Nobody really knew what their goals were, if they were going for social commentary or just having a laugh. The Juilliard were essentially a collection of street performers that had banded together for protection. As you might imagine, performing on the streets was not exactly a safe thing to start with, but especially in the Night City of 2020, Juilliard performers travelled in armed pairs for safety and would retaliate if any member was molested, even by other gangs. 15% of each member's take went to the group, and the leaders organised a weekly sign-up system of who was allowed to use what spots when. Senior members got to choose their spots first, and new members last. The Juilliard took great umbrage with non-members working in their town. You played a Night City street corner without their permission, and you might find yourself a guitarist without fingers. Yeah, one of the most notable combat gangs of the day were the Sacred Blades, a group that styled themselves on stereotypes about Native American cultures, though they were actually a pretty multi-ethnic group. The gang basically existed so young males could show off their physical prowess. They tolerated some female followers to do domestic chores, but there were no female members. Some of them had cyber weapons and guns, but they considered it dishonourable to use them outside of emergencies, favouring Bowie knives and machetes. They engaged in ritualistic scarring, use of hallucinogens and mild self-torture to endure the body to pain. New members must prove themselves by publicly defeating a rival gang member with only their hands and a blade. Moving on to the terrifyingly bizarre... the Bozos were a prankster gang when they first appeared 3 years ago. They operated in the area just north of the university, and initially pulled annoying but largely harmless slapstick pranks on people while dressed as clowns. What made them notable was that they wore no makeup. The crazy red hair, chalk white skin, big red noses, all of it they had themselves surgically biosculpted to look that way. Their MO changed about a year ago when they got a new boss known only as the Great Bozo. Rumour had it he was an Arasaka researcher who had a cyberpsychosis episode. Now the killer clowns preyed on people's worst fears. They'd been known to lurk in dark apartments, trap people in small spaces filled with rats, and sometimes do despicable acts as pedestrian as slashing tyres and literally taking candy from children. The Voodoo Boys were believed to have been started by some major criminal contact from Florida or the Caribbean. Their main business was selling drugs to university students, but that's not what they were infamous for. Frankly, the Voodoo Boys were nihilistic psychopaths that enjoyed terrorizing their community. They tortured, raped, murdered, and maimed without rhyme or reason. They used ritualistic killings and left body parts as warnings. They deliberately invoked occult overtones as an intimidation tactic, its members wearing bones through their noses, tattoos and black feathers implanted in their scalp. There were almost 24 more gangs that at least had a short description, but those were the more fleshed out ones. The Blood Raisers were the current top dogs in the combat zone, Yaz being responsible for about 40 murders a week in addition to various robberies, muggings, arsons and assassinations. The Red Chrome Legion was a gang of militant neo-fascist skinheads that spent their day terrorising anyone different from themselves. The Iron Sights, being heavily cybernetically enhanced, were a booster gang most infamous for their signature use of rippers, blades that emerged from the fingertips as their preferred cyber weapon. Then of course there were the Inquisitors, the object of hate for every other gang in Night City. They believed that cybernetics were evil, though some of their members did have biological enhancements, and otherwise relied entirely on training. Nobody could find where these guys operated out of or where their leader was, more than just that they were willing to go to war with every other gang in the city. There was also a little combat gang near Japantown called the Tiger Claws. They are known to occasionally act in defense of the Japanese community, and were believed to receive financial backing from the Arasaka Corporation. They mostly relied on reflex enhancements and martial arts training. This was Night City in 2020, a city of contrasts, where corporate towers gleamed in the sun while the streets below ran red with blood, where dreams could come true if you were lucky, skilled and ruthless enough, but where most people's dreams died in the gutter. It was a city on the edge, balanced precariously between order and chaos, prosperity and poverty, hope and despair, and it was about to be pushed over that edge. To understand what happened next to Night City, we need to talk about the Fourth Corporate War. This conflict would reshape the world and leave Night City in ruins, a catastrophe from which it would take decades to recover. The war began in 2021 when a German shipping and nautical technology company failed. Competing American and French companies attempted to acquire it, with one hiring Arasaka paramilitary forces to sabotage their rival, and the other hiring Militech for the same reason. As they attacked one another's assets, autonomous weapons were released to terrorize the sea lanes, creating severe disruption to international trade. Bioweapons were unleashed in several coastal cities, though thankfully not Night City, to disrupt supply chains. All of that was bad enough, but over time, the focus of the fight began to shift to a confrontation between Arasaka and Militech. Both wanted to knock their longtime rivals out of business entirely, and their grudge escalated over time from covert operations to pitched battles that left entire cities in ruins. As international companies with interests and assets all over the world, they attacked each other wherever they could do damage. Night City was no exception. The United States was Militech's home turf. As the military's #1 weapon system provider, Night City was home to Arasaka's American Division headquarters and Militech offices. Various neighborhoods and businesses in the city employed Arasaka or Militech security contracts, not to mention a Militech training facility in the suburbs. Naturally, it was the site of some vicious urban fighting, especially around the corporate centre where both companies had offices. Even before the climax of the war, large sections of the once relatively safe central city were reduced to a war zone, with tanks, drones and kill squads in the streets. Both sides sent not only their paramilitary forces, but also large numbers of recruited edge runners against one another. Large numbers of people were abandoning the city to avoid the crossfire, to at least get to the relative safety of Haywood or Pacifica. The city government would declare martial law under Arasaka's influence, though the NCPD would fare so poorly in this chaos that it basically disintegrated. Arasaka troops ruled the streets once again. Militech and many other corporations pulled out of the central city as Arasaka solidified its control. Even the outer areas wouldn't be completely safe. In late 2022, Arasaka would launch an armoured blitzkrieg attack on Militech's Haywood testing facility. It ended badly for them, as the Arasaka tanks happened to run into a field test for a new anti-tank missile system. By 2023, world governments would turn firmly against Militech and Arasaka. European governments nationalised both companies' assets within their borders. After attempting a coup in Japan, Arasaka was rebuked by the Japanese government, and many assets were nationalised within Japanese borders. In the United States, President Elizabeth Kress reactivated the reserve status of Militech CEO Donald Lundy, formerly a US Marine Corps general, and threatened him with a court-martial. Militech forces started to stand down and cooperate with national governments. The US military and Militech forcibly seized Arasaka facilities within their borders. The fight wasn't quite over yet, however. Arasaka's acting CEO, Kei Arasaka, eldest son of Saburo Arasaka, took refuge in Night City and flooded the area with Arasaka troops. The idea was to hold out long enough to force a settlement that could salvage some of Arasaka's power and influence. They had a bargaining chip, a database of uncorrupted data their netrunners had accumulated. To step back a moment, a large part of this conflict had been digital, with Arasaka using a deadly program called Soul Killer to destroy the minds of targets and create a copy of their consciousness for interrogation. Militech recruited Rach Bartmoss, probably the most brilliant and misanthropic netrunner in the world, to combat it. Arasaka was eventually able to track down Bartmoss and drop a rock on his apartment using an orbital artillery weapon, but that only created a bigger problem. The data crash, as it is remembered, was effectively a collection of Bartmoss's best digital weapons waiting on a timer to be released into the net if he were ever to die. He abused the access Militech gave him to embed his work in the framework of every net-connected computer used to reach cyberspace. At first, it only seemed like odd data corruptions happening in random databases, but it soon became clear that every net-connected computer was infected. Data and records stored on computers became unreliable, and the net was filled with deadly attack programs that threatened any netrunner who so much as dipped a toe in. Eventually, Netwatch was forced to deliberately sabotage and crash the protocols most computers used to access the net, though some servers still remained. This meant that Arasaka's bargaining chip, vast troves of uncorrupted data held on an isolated server, was very valuable and would give them a huge advantage in rebuilding after the war. Furthermore, rumours spread that they were threatening to unleash Soul Killer on the residents of Night City en masse. President Kress was not interested in negotiating. The only thing that kept her from charging in immediately was that Night City, being part of the Free State of Northern California, was technically not fully part of the United States. Once they received permission from the governor, US and Militech troops advanced on the city. Fierce street-to-street fighting razed entire neighborhoods, but the assault was partially a distraction. Morgan Blackhand, a famous edgerunner and Militech's favorite problem solver, was put in charge of covert operations against Arasaka and ordered to prepare an infiltration team. Strike Team Alpha, consisting of a host of high-profile edgerunners led by Johnny Silverhand, would enter the building from the top to target the Soul Killer lab and rescue Alt Cunningham, the creator of Soul Killer and Johnny's old girlfriend, who'd been digitized by the weapon to continue its development. This too was ultimately a distraction, as the true target was the secure database bargaining chip held in the basement. That element of the team was to plant a 0.1 kiloton tactical nuke and detonate it in the foundations to destroy the bargaining chip and bring down the building while doing minimal damage to the rest of the city. Exactly what happened during the assault is a bit unclear, but the bomb detonated in the wrong place. Instead of detonating in the foundations, the bomb exploded on the 120th floor in the Soul Killer lab. Some of the strike team was able to evacuate before this happened, but neither Morgan Blackhand nor Johnny Silverhand has been seen since. Morgan Blackhand was last seen squaring off with Adam Smasher, one of Arasaka's favourite security assets, on the roof of Arasaka Tower. The location of the blast enhanced its destructive power. Most of the central city was reduced to rubble in seconds, killing everyone in the immediate area instantly. To make matters worse, the explosion triggered a minor earthquake that destroyed much of the power, water, and gas infrastructure of the city, and partially liquefied much of the fill that the city had been built on, leading to significant flooding as parts of the city basically sank into the ocean. Secondary fires triggered by the explosion, both in the city and the surrounding area, destroyed much of the city's housing, leaving many of its remaining residents homeless. Particulate debris from the blast would rain down on Northern California for months and tinged the skies red, giving the post-war era its colloquial name, the Time of the Red. This closing catastrophe of the Fourth Corporate War would be remembered as the Night City Holocaust. The Cyberpunk 2077 game states that 15,000 people died as a result of the bomb, a horrific number, but one that reflects the relatively small size of the tactical nuclear weapon used. The residual radiation from this sort of weapon was fairly minimal, but the central city was barely habitable, if at all, in the early days after the blast. Recovery from the war would be a long road for Night City. Gas pipes, water mains, and electrical grids were shattered. The streets were filled with debris and wrecked cars. Even buildings that had not collapsed or been burned out were heavily damaged. The outer suburbs became overcrowded refugee camps as 2 million newly homeless residents fled what was left of the central city. Once middle-class suburbia became tent cities. Some moved further east into the neighbouring towns and cities that had been abandoned during the collapse 20 years earlier. Oddly, a new sort of unity emerged among these people. Everyone was in survival mode, but neighbourhoods banded together with a sense of purpose, even if it was grudgingly and there was little trust. In the aftermath of the catastrophe, President Kress seized control of the narrative. The public didn't know anything about the raid, or that a Militech strike team had brought the bomb into their city. She used this knowledge as blackmail to further bring Militech under her control. To the public, she deployed all the propaganda resources of the American government to paint a picture of Arasaka as an evil foreign corporation run by a madman. They claimed that Arasaka had wantonly destroyed an American city as part of an area denial strategy to keep Militech from taking its American headquarters. Arasaka's charters to operate in the United States were revoked, and its board members were declared terrorists. Their assets were seized or driven offshore. Thus, Elizabeth Kress was initially very popular among the survivors of Night City. But that impression quickly soured when it became clear that she had no intention of helping them rebuild their city. President Kress wrote Night City off as unrecoverable and instead offered sanctuary to the refugees. She did this firstly because the nation's resources were already stretched thin, and secondly because Kress hoped to use the refugees to pressure the Free State of Northern California's government to come back into the fold of the federal government. Some may have taken Kress up on her offer, but if anything, it mostly inspired an attitude of stubborn defiance in the people of Night City. They weren't going anywhere, and they would rebuild without her help. President Kress declared a state of emergency during the Fourth Corporate War, and continued it for decades, declaring that there would be no national elections until a treaty existed with the Free States. Thus, President Kress would reign as a de facto dictator for the next 50 years. Meanwhile, several of the Western Free States, including Northern California, as well as like-minded Canadian provinces, formed a mostly economic union called the Pacifica Confederation. Though playing host to several US military bases, the Confederation provided a stable alternative to the new United States government. The Confederation allowed Night City to survive as a largely independent city-state, serving as a free trade zone for the Confederation and a major entry point into the country for those who didn't want to deal with the federal government. Back to the reconstruction of Night City. Initially, this task was made even harder by the collapse of the net due to the data crash. But in 2030, Night City developed one of the first city nets, re-establishing network communications at least inside the city. Reconstruction was finally underway by 2035. What was left of the city government called in favours from outside resources. Much of the recovery was owed to the Aldecaldo nomad clan and their allies in the Stormtech Corporation. Stormtech had been responsible for a project to restore the city of Chicago after it had to be all but abandoned during the collapse, though the Fourth Corporate War undid most of that progress. Nonetheless, they were well equipped for the job and had a good working relationship with the Aldecaldos, who would provide transportation and a labour force. The first step of that process was to build temporary housing from shipping containers and later from formcrete modules brought in by rail. Before even that could happen, they had to clear the area of rubble. Carting it off to a distant landfill wasn't an option, so local workforces used bulldozers and jury-rigged tanks from the war to push gigatons of debris into the bay, and much of it ended up being used as fill, and the bays were dredged for further fill, so the shape of the coastline changed once again. Nightcorp offered generous rewards to anyone willing to help clear out the radioactive rubble at Ground Zero. Both the corporation and the city government claimed casualties from this operation were minimal, but they avoided giving any specific number. By the 2040s, the work was constant. Construction sites littered the inner city as old buildings were repaired and new ones sprang up. In particular, they began construction of mega buildings with the goal of quickly creating safe areas to house the vast homeless population still living in the tent cities. In the early 2040s, the truth about what happened that night 20 years earlier finally came out in a series of exposés and a book about the Fourth Corporate War by independent journalist Trace Santiago. The big lie that Arasaka was completely to blame for the Night City Holocaust crumbled overnight. Many Night City citizens turned even more firmly against Militech and the US government. Some even began to view Arasaka favourably. Others still blamed Arasaka, reasoning that their headquarters was still the reason the war came to their doorstep in the first place. Opinions in Night City were sharply divided, and the events of 2023 were still the subject of countless conspiracy theories. By 2045, Night City was still a chaotic place despite the reconstruction, certainly more so than in 2020. Civil authority was weak. Violent gangs infested the southern half of the city like never before. The old city centre was still a pile of radioactive rubble, and much of the population was still crammed into the overpacked suburbs. Violence, riots, and even the occasional plague didn't surprise anyone around here. Nonetheless, the people had become fiercely independent in their desire to avoid being shackled to the new United States government and see their city rise from the ashes. Overall, Night City was in a very damaged state, and about half the city was either in ruins or little more than a slum filled with temporary housing. As to who was running the show these days, well, that was a good question. The old city government was in shambles after the war, and what was left had been too busy trying to put things back together to hold elections. The mayor's seat was vacant. The city government was now essentially a junta run by several interests and factions. The remaining officials of the old city government, the nomad families, various prominent edge runners, and corporate interests. That last included Biotechnica, Continental Brands, Network 54, Militech, Danger Gal, Rocklin Augmentics, Solve Oil, Trauma Team, Ziggurat, Petrochem, Zarafa, and just recently Arasaka, though only in secret. Yes, Arasaka may have been banned from operating in the United States, but shifting attitudes in Night City apparently opened the door for them to start asserting power covertly. In lieu of a mayor, these factions instead appointed a city manager to each district or neighbourhood, charged with running basic services in that area. Even Combat Zone District had city managers, though they had no real ability to control or contest the gangs in the area. The city managers formed the Night City Council, representing their districts but More importantly, the factions that appointed them. Fights between these factions were frequent and often resolved by street violence rather than negotiation. The most powerful official in the old city government left was the former assistant mayor Garvin Hackinson, now Councilman Hackinson. He was still playing politics and carefully balancing the various factions at play in Night City, though he didn't have control over any of them. As for city services, they existed to some degree in the rebuilt areas and some of the overpacked suburbs. At least 2 public hospitals from before the war were still standing, though prone to power, gas and water disruptions. There was also an ever-shifting number of clinics around the city that had sprung up to meet the needs of the people, often grown out of the covert ripper docks of the 2020s. For transportation, the Night City Transit Corporation was still running bus services on most major thoroughfares. The NCART subway system that once connected urban and suburban areas was now mostly flooded with seawater. Plans were underway to build a new monorail system and extend it to serve the new areas of the city. The transcontinental maglev tunnel that once connected Night City to the Midwest and East Coast of the nation was no longer operable. The only operable rail line was a newly constructed high-security connection from the executive zone to the Watson development and Little Europe. The most reliable method of transportation in and out of the city was with the nomads. Nomad clan-sponsored convoys up and down the coast or even out east to the edge of the new United States bristled with enough weapons and numbers to deter attackers. Some of these convoys may have consisted of hundreds of vehicles. Sea-based nomads using everything from speedboats to abandoned luxury liners and huge container ships similarly provided safe passage out of Night City via the sea lanes. As for air travel, there wasn't any, at least not for the average person. Most regular transit was severely disrupted during the war, and the Night City Metropolitan Airport never recovered. The nomads actually ran a lot of aerozeps, essentially modernised cargo blimps, regionally and overseas. There were also apparently an assortment of ex-Eurospace Agency and High Rider pilots running their own suborbital scramjets. These so-called Delta jocks were known to avoid legal entanglements and would move any cargo for the right price. Private flights in AVs were still an option for the very wealthy. There were currently plans to build an orbital spaceplane launch site and mass driver on Morro Rock just off the coast. Now, I have to talk about the current state of the net. The net as it was no longer existed. Netwatch was actively seeking out and destroying the remaining servers connected to it, and anyone who tried was risking attack by roving offensive programs capable of killing any netrunner they met and rogue artificial intelligences. And rumour had it Netwatch was working on something called the Black Wall to serve as a more permanent solution. In the meantime, what replaced it was a series of highly secure private networks and air-gapped systems. The need to physically go to a place in order to jack into a closed system was a common gripe among netrunners of this era. The City Council commissioned the Ziggurat Corporation to build its CityNet in 2030, building off the old Dataterm network to provide a reliable system for transferring information and access to the data pool. The data pool was essentially a city-wide public resource managed by the City Council for uploading and sharing content between residents. The CityNet didn't allow easy contact between different cities, but Ziggurat had allowed cheap city-to-city communication via patched-together phone lines, the free space optics, and even nomad couriers. This sort of long-distance communication generally took the form of recorded voice, video or text transmitted in hourly bursts. Direct real-time communication was possible through communication satellites, but was much more expensive. Thus, this was a much more locally isolated era. individuals now had something like smartphones that allowed them to freely access the city net and the data pool. They were called agents, and what made them special was their self-adaptive AI. It wasn't a true artificial intelligence, but it was capable of learning from the behaviour of their owner and acted to help organise their life. Agents could be programmed with a simulated personality and even a holographic form to interact with. More expensive agents had more features. As for the police, well, as I said, the NCPD essentially fell apart during the Fourth Corporate War as corporate troops turned the area into a war zone. It had been rebuilt somewhat, though they were even more undermanned and had even less control over the streets than they did in 2020. The only areas that could count on any level of reliable police presence were the partially rebuilt or rebuilding urban zones. The executive zone had corporate security, and the suburbs often had to rely on less formal types of local law enforcement for safety. The only time you were likely to see NCPD in the combat zone was when they dropped in periodically and started slaughtering every gang member they saw. They liken these operations to pruning back overgrown weeds. The sole exception to these territorial rules was MaxTac, once the sole surviving element of the NCPD during the war. MaxTac now operated as an independent organisation that contracted with neighbourhoods, governments, and even some private individuals to tackle cyber psychos, hostage situations, military-class weapons, and similar dangers to the public. The current commander of MaxTac was one Max Hammerman. He was a sergeant in the NCPD back in 2020. Now he was the famously incorruptible leader of one of, if not the most deadly groups in the city. By policy, MaxTac would drop in anywhere in the city in response to a cyber psycho incident, or when they'd been called in and then do whatever it took to end the danger. They'd even been known to gun down security forces if they were too slow to put down their weapons. Now let's discuss what the various districts of Night City were like at this time. Not only had the physical shape of the city changed, but many districts have been renamed or redrawn, so they may not align perfectly with the old districts of 2020. First, there was the Hot Zone, ground zero for the explosion back in 2023. It comprised the old city centre, corporate centre, and med centre. This area was still mostly rubble, and parts of it were still radioactive. You'd find few people here except scavengers and crews trying to remove the rubble, save for one place. Somewhat miraculously, on the northern edge of the Hot Zone was a surviving building housing the Totentans. The bar was a gathering place for gangs before the war, and it still was now. Fights were so common that it was considered a slow night if the body count was under 20. Next was the rebuilding urban centre, areas that escaped the worst of the bomb and the fighting. Parts of the old NCART system were still functioning in this area, though it suffered from periodic flooding. All areas near the ocean were prone to flooding, and utilities access could be inconsistent. These areas were currently filled with cranes and construction sites, as old buildings were repaired and new buildings were constructed. The work never stopped. First of the new neighbourhoods was the Glen, location of the new City Hall and other government buildings. Notably, NCPD Precinct Number 1 also straddled the boundary with the combat zone here. Given the government buildings and the fact that it was surrounded by combat zones on 3 sides, it was likely the district most heavily defended by the NCPD. This was also where you'd find Club Atlantis, another venue that survived the war. To the northwest was Little Europe, and filled with a mix of the old brick buildings of Richard Knight's Disneyland imaginings and new corporate skyscrapers. Once known as the last bastion of the mob, The most notable local institution in the area was the Holy Angels Church, another survivor of the war. Father Kevin was still running the place, providing sanctuary and aid to those who needed it, mediation for those who asked for it, and a taste of his old solo skills for those who threatened his parish. Up north, the city of North Oak no longer existed, but the NorCal military base still did, demonstrating the increasingly close connection between Militech and the new United States government. This US military base was mostly staffed by Militech soldiers and housed the Militech offices for the area. The base was well fortified and closed off from the rest of the city. Access to non-government personnel was restricted. Where North Oak used to be, you'd find the Watson development. Refugees flooded Old North Oak after the war, and the decision was made to incorporate the area into the city proper. It was in the process of being developed as a brand new district where mega buildings and arcologies were being built to house those still homeless from the war. Already holding a number of corporate offices, the plan was ultimately to develop Watson as a new corporate centre of sorts. Additionally, as the old Japantown and Little China districts were now combat zones, much of the city's Asian population had migrated to a Watson neighbourhood, colloquially referred to as Kabuki. There was a notable local leader in this area, a young and idealistic community organiser named Lucius Rhine. He was a small player now, but he had an important role to play in the city's history going forward. Moving on to Upper Marina, we had a genuinely bustling district that had actually been well maintained. The area was itself a mix of somewhat gentrified neighbourhoods and the old industrial spaces. The old stadium was still there. It also had one of the city's last proper hospitals, the City Medical Centre. The Afterlife Solo Bar was also still running here, near the edge of the hot zone, now having acquired a tradition of naming drinks after legendary deceased solos. On the opposite side of the hot zone was the University District, home to Night City's only university, and it was still operating despite everything. However, it had essentially become a heavily secured fortress in response to repeated attacks by booster gangs. Campus security was intense. Biotechnica had its campus on the edge of the university. Leaving the city proper, Pacifica was not apparently seriously impacted by the war. The Playland by the Sea amusement park was still operating, and the beachfront property was presumably as beautiful as ever. It was in a constant state of renovation, and the park was protected by corporate security. Lastly, we had not a district exactly, but Morro Rock, an island just off the coast. Being the most stable geographic feature in the area, Orbital Air was given the rights to develop the area as an orbital spaceplane launch and mass driver site. Currently, Morro Rock was one giant construction site, as it was in the process of becoming a major installation for transporting people and goods across the globe and into orbit. And to the east of the city proper was a heavily guarded gated community carved into the open hills, reserved for high-ranking corporate executives and their families. It wasn't only a residential area, as the high-end luxury homes were also within convenient distance of shopping and recreational facilities. This included golf courses, private spas and clubs. This area was very well defended by corporate security forces and connected to the rebuilding zones via a specially built secure train line. Now let's look at where the greater portion of Night City's population seemed to live in the time of the Red. After the war, the old suburbs of Night City, namely Rancho Coronado, Haywood, and even the former executive zone of Westbrook, were reduced to vast tent cities as residents fled the largely uninhabitable city centre. The current overpacked suburbs were born out of these refugee camps. Quite a lot of temporary housing, from converted shipping containers to prefabricated units, had been erected since then, but these areas were still crowded, unregulated and crime-ridden. The hope was to eventually alleviate these problems by moving people into the mega buildings under construction, but that was still some time off. Haywood was the most overpacked of these areas, housing a large percentage of the city's population all on its own. Over time, a class divide had emerged as wealthier citizens gravitated closer to the city and the industrial zone in the north, leaving the south to poorer residents. The poorer residents had begun calling the area Santo Domingo. At the edge of Haywood, really the edge of Night City itself, there was large encampment where the Aldecaldo's nomads ran an expansive trade and transportation network. That's where you wanted to go if you wanted to hire a guide across the Badlands or arrange a delivery. Despite being essentially within Haywood, the Haywood Industrial Zone was now considered a separate district. It was the largest industrial zone in the city, filled with warehouses, factories, construction equipment, and even some derelict cargo ships. The offices of Zarafa, a Russian construction robotics company that rose to prominence in the post-war era, were in this area. Up north was New Westbrook. Back in 2020, Westbrook was what the executive zone was today, a highly secure upscale area for the richest Night City residents. Now it was swamped by a large homeless population, both from the war as well as the recent gentrification of the rebuilding inner city. Some of the old glamour remained, as the expanded district also had a number of corporate campuses, but much of it was still tent cities. Lastly, there was the old Beaverville of Rancho Coronado. Once filled with row upon row of identical middle-class houses, the area had been taken over by tent cities and small industrial facilities built out of the now defunct mini-malls that once dotted the area. Finally, we come to the combat zones. What city officials feared in 2020 came to pass after the war, and the combat zone expanded from its former confines to consume the southern reaches of the city. Gangs ruled these areas with violence, and no law enforcement dared even attempt to police the streets, save for occasionally dropping in to take shots at the gangsters before leaving. No reconstruction had been attempted in these areas. Abandoned or burnt-out buildings were common, and some city blocks had been reduced to rubble. Old Japantown was largely abandoned during the war and now was almost exclusively inhabited by gangs. The most notable feature of the area was the Crisis Medical Center, one of the only hospitals to survive the war. The center was neutral ground to all gangs and factions in the area. Little China was similarly abandoned by many of its former residents, but small communities still continued to eke out a life, defending themselves from the gangs. The gangs of Little China, however, were still controlled by businessmen. The criminal kingpin David Ling Po and the Wang Fang Tong was still the largest Chinese criminal organization in the western United States, and after decades, David Ling Po was only more entrenched. No longer having to worry about the NCPD in his district now that it was a combat zone, he could probably do whatever he pleased. Back in the old combat zone, well, there wasn't much to say about it in terms of what had changed. It was still a hellhole of violent psychos and unrestricted gang warfare. Nobody controlled this place save whichever booster gang managed to reach the top of the heap for a little while. Then there was South Night City, a defunct port and industrial sprawl. This was a bad area before it became a combat zone, and it had only gotten worse. The abandoned warehouses were regularly used as hideouts and headquarters by various gangs and criminals. The Tiger Claws and the Yakuza had a presence here. Lastly, there were the Badlands beyond the city limits. The work of nomads with reclaimed military hardware had cleared out a lot of the roving gangs. Many of the surrounding towns and small cities in the region that had been abandoned during the collapse of the late 1990s had been reclaimed by settlers who abandoned the city after the war or came from elsewhere. The safest way to go when travelling was still with a nomad caravan, but all in all, the Badlands were a lot safer than they used to be. Gangs break up or flame out all the time. So many of the gangs that ran the streets in 2020 weren't around anymore. The DJs scattered. The Brainiacs fell victim to Rach Bartmus's viruses in the data crash. The Wild Things were mostly wiped out by Militech soldiers. The Sacred Blades and the Black Queens would have been near ground zero for the bomb if they weren't already driven out by corporate troops. Still, some of the old gangs had clung on through the decades. The Bozos, everyone's favourite bio-sculpted insane clowns, were one such surviving gang from the old days. The Killer Clowns were just as crazy as ever, and still inflicted their sadistic brand of humour on the residents of Night City. The much more benign pranksters of the Philharmonic Vampires were also still around, and just as enigmatic as ever. Unfortunately, the Inquisitors were also still kicking around. These cultish fanatics still hated cyberware and would save your soul by ripping it right out of your body. As then, it was the same now. The Inquisitors were at war with every booster gang in the city. Everyone hated them. Some of the nastier combat gangs were also still around. The Iron Sights were still a gang of borderline cyber psychos that favoured rippers, but they fell on hard times after the war when their patron Arasaka was forced out of the country. Lately, however, they'd gotten a new mysterious benefactor. The Red Chrome Legion was still marching around in black uniforms and chrome, spouting neo-fascist hate against anyone they thought wasn't right. If those groups of lunatics were still around, you'd better believe Maelstrom was. They were founded by booster gang members with a grudge against the Inquisitors, and that much hadn't changed in the post-war era. Maelstrom settled a feud with a smaller cyber psycho gang and adopted more meat-hating philosophies from them. There'd been an exponential increase in highly visible and extreme cyberware usage among the gang. As you might imagine, the hatred and violence between Maelstrom and the Inquisitors had only escalated with time, and fights between them happened more and more often. The Tiger Claws had also survived the time of the Red, despite losing the financial support of Arasaka. Known for fast motorbikes, enhanced reflexes, and martial arts, the Tiger Claws these days were a fierce protection gang for Night City's Asian population. They also helped rebuild some sections of Japantown. Then there were the Voodoo Boys, essentially a bunch of sadistic drug dealers that adopted cult ritual trappings to terrorize people. Things had been getting harder for them recently, as real Haitian refugees had made their way to the city following a worsening climate situation. They were offended by the Voodoo Boys. Now it was the Voodoo Boys who'd been turning up maimed and mutilated by machetes. This was a developing situation. Those were the old gangs. Now for some of the new ones. 6th Street was founded by veterans of the Fourth Corporate War. As they returned to their families and neighbourhoods in Night City, they found a near-lawless wreck. So these veterans banded together to form 6th Street, a vigilante protector gang that offered protection in various neighbourhoods throughout the city. They had a good relationship with Holy Angels Church, where they were welcomed as protectors. Lately, however, they had been forced to move into smuggling and extortion to fund their activities. Of course, there were still poser gangs. These days, there was a group called the Prime Time Players. They were another protection gang that bio-sculpted themselves to resemble old sitcom characters and TV shows from previous eras. They were apparently divided into various territorial factions based on preferred shows, each attempting to protect their neighbourhoods. It was as if TV show fandoms became street gangs. It probably won't surprise you to hear that various apocalyptic cults sprang up in this chaotic era. In Night City, one of those was a group called the Reckoners. They roamed the street recruiting from the homeless and mugging people for donations. They preached about the upcoming harvest of souls, and a few of them were crazy enough to try and bring that about as soon as possible with C4. These last two weren't technically street gangs as you might think of them, but worth mentioning regardless. The Steel Vaqueros were a nomad gang out of Salinas, California, that ran coastal highway convoys from Santa Cruz to the southern cities. They had supply agreements with various reclaimer groups attempting to rebuild Night City and the surrounding area. They took in any dependable person that displayed enough skill to keep up. Lastly, there were the Scabbers. These were not a unified group so much as a general desperate population of homeless scavengers that sifted through the debris of ruined city areas in search of technology and materials to sell. It was a dangerous life, not just because of the constant urban warfare, but also because they must dig deeper and deeper into dangerous rubble as the ruins were picked clean. The time between the 2045 and 2077 settings is the least fleshed out in the Cyberpunk timeline. This was a deliberate choice by the video game developers and the tabletop team so as not to impose major developments on what could be done in the 2045 setting. Most of what we know is that the rebuilding process was largely successful. The mega buildings relieved overpopulation in the suburbs, and much of the population migrated back into the city proper. The city was able to reclaim the combat zone areas for the most part, and further alterations to the region's coastline were made. Districts and neighbourhoods would be once again renamed and redrawn in this time as the rebuilding process proceeded. The Night City government recovered and was finally able to assert its role as the central municipal authority. Orbital Air would finish construction of the Orbital Airspace Centre on Morrow Rock, making Night City an orbital transport hub. None of this would abolish the city's gang problems entirely, or the corruption of corporate excess that persisted to some degree even in the relatively anti-corporate post-war era. Nonetheless, the situation of the city became much more stable. Of the specifics we know, I can mention a few. There was apparently a large immigration from Asia in the late 2040s, mostly ethnic Chinese moving into the Watson development. In the 2050s, the last of the refugee camps and shanty towns in Westbrook were brutally cleared out by corporate security forces under the auspices of a war on crime initiative. There were also a few citywide crises that happened in this time period, namely recurring disease outbreaks in Night City. In 2051, a major outbreak of bird flu killed 7,000 people. A second outbreak in 2059 killed 10,000, while a third in 2061 killed 12,000. This led to the city adopting the Avian Extermination Act in 2063, which is why you don't see many birds in 2077. In 2062, Haiti had to be abandoned entirely after a series of vicious storms. A large population of refugees ended up settling in Night City's Pacifica district, where they were employed in the development of the area. Also in 2062, one of the reclaimed outlying towns, Laguna Bend, was forcefully evacuated so that a dam could be constructed. The area was turned into a reservoir serving Night City. The next great crisis to threaten Night City would start with a long overdue change of leadership in the new United States government. After almost half a century in power, President Elizabeth Kress stepped down as president. She had worked to keep Militech closely tied to the federal government, and as if to prove just how closely connected Militech and the government had become, her successor would be a former Militech CEO. Rosalind Myers had been Militech CEO for almost a decade before she resigned, and was elected President of the new United States. She held much the same ideas about re-establishing federal power over the free states as her predecessor, and presented a program to accomplish just that. Shortly after entering office, a few free states, including South California, agreed to her demands, but most did not. Northern California joined an alliance of free states to resist, and the new United States government sent in troops to force the issue. The Unification War had begun. The battles were famously vicious as cutting-edge tech was deployed on the battlefield, both in terms of combat vehicles and cybernetic weapons. The Arasaka Corporation, seeking to re-establish influence in North America, quietly sent funding, advisors, and advanced weapons to the free states. Night City even received humanitarian aid from the Soviet Union, which, yes, still exists in this alternate timeline, albeit in a weakened state, though observers claim this aid was actually weapon shipments. Despite this, the Free States were hard-pressed by federal forces and their Militech hardware. By mid-2070, all of the belligerent Free States, save for Northern California and Texas, were ultimately occupied by federal and nationalized Militech troops. Night City had avoided being directly attacked up to that point, but it would only be a matter of time. One particular man among the city government took action. You might remember Lucius Rhine. He was a community organizer in the Watson development back in 2045. After decades in city politics, he was now a member of the city council. Reaching out with contacts made in those intervening years, Rhine called for Arasaka for protection. So when a new United States Army division was sighted in the outskirts of Night City, an Arasaka supercarrier arrived in Del Coronado Bay within days. The federal troops chose to withdraw. The new United States government feared the sort of escalation engaging Arasaka directly might bring. The Japanese corporation had spent decades rebuilding and improving public relations to re-establish their old influence. With Militech material and men participating in the war, it could easily spin out into another corporate war. Judging that the new United States government lacked the ability to pay the cost of such a conflict, Rosalind Myers came to the negotiating table. A peace treaty was signed out in Arvin, South California. The Unification Treaty, also called the Arvin Accord, allowed the free states to keep their autonomy as long as they made some concessions to participate in and cooperate with the federal government. The government was able to claim they'd taken great steps towards unification on paper, while the free states retained much of their autonomy in reality. The independent Republic of Texas refused to sign this treaty, by the way, and remains belligerent. In the aftermath of the war, Night City was rededicated. Night City seceded from both the Free State of Northern California and the new United States of America, becoming a sovereign international free city. The ban on Arasaka operating openly in the United States, imposed at the close of the Fourth Corporate War 50 years earlier, no longer applied, and the city government welcomed them with open arms. Freedom would come at a price. Corporate interests flooded into the city to take advantage of its status, chief among them Arasaka. Arasaka quickly started buying up property and influence to establish themselves as the most powerful corporation in the city. Public opinion of Arasaka in Night City was high at first, and Lucius Rhine was elected to be the mayor. Rhine and the city council gave Arasaka permission to build a new American Arasaka headquarters, on the very site that the original had stood 50 years ago. Construction was quickly completed later in 2070. The new United States government would build a concrete wall on the northern border of Southern California, which includes the southern edge of Night City's city limits. Attitudes towards Arasaka and the mayor would sour quickly in the following years, as it became clear to the people of Night City just how ruthless the corporation was in securing its American foothold, and just how in the pocket of the corporation the city government was. To some people, Lucius Rhine was still the hero that saved the city from a federal occupation, but to many he became viewed as one of its most corrupt politicians, and that's saying something. By 2077, Night City had fully recovered from the devastation of the Fourth Corporate War. The infrastructure was completely rebuilt. The corporate plaza gleamed once more with towering skyscrapers. The streets were filled with people, traffic, and the constant hum of urban life. But beneath the surface, the city was as dangerous and corrupt as it had ever been. The government had regained control of the city since the time of the Red, but corporate influence in government was at its highest since 2020. Mayor Lucius Rhine was firmly in the pocket of the Arasaka Corporation. 2077 was an election year, but the process was thrown into a bit of chaos by the sudden death of Mayor Rhine. His death left his deputy mayor, a man named Weldon Holt, often called Rhine's bulldog, as acting mayor. Holt also chose to stand for election in Rhine's stead. The challenger was Night City Council member Jefferson Perales, once a Haywood kid from poverty who received a Night Corps scholarship to study law. Perales positioned himself as an anti-establishment candidate that opposed corporate control of city government. He'd pulled ahead of Holt in the polls, as the latter was generally viewed as a corporate stooge under Arasaka's thumb. The infrastructure had completely recovered from the war. Flooding and power failures weren't much of an issue. As far as transportation, the old NCART system had been rebuilt as an above-ground raised rail network that connected various areas of the city. Combat Cab was still in operation, and several vehicles with their logo could be seen throughout the city. The dominant taxi service these days was Delamain, however, a new company that operated entirely self-driving vehicles and was managed by an artificial intelligence named Delamain. The Orbital Airspace Center provided orbital transport for passengers and cargo. There was a conventional airport called Richard Knight International mentioned in Cyberpunk 2077, but it wasn't clear where it was since it wasn't on the map, unless it was integrated with the Space Center. Getting to the city by land wasn't the easiest thing to do, especially from the south, where you had to deal with the South California Border Patrol and a massive concrete border wall. In any other direction, the Badlands were still dangerous. Gangs and nomad bandits called the Raf and Shiv could be found squatting in abandoned towns and facilities all throughout. If you wanted certain safe transport, you'd better get nomad or corporate security escorts. The net connectivity of the city was roughly similar to the time of the Red. Connections were mostly local, and connectivity between distant regions was very limited and presumably expensive. Most public networks were closely policed by Netwatch. The old net was now mostly sealed off by the Black Wall, a digital construct created by Netwatch to repel the dangerous AIs of the old net and prevent spillover of dangerous viruses into modern systems. As for personal connectivity, smartphone-like devices still existed, but a lot of people seem to have communication and other functionalities directly integrated into their bodies with implants. For those without either, the data term access terminals positioned throughout the city provided public information, local web browsing, and other functions. Now let's talk about the Night City Police Department. Back in 2076, the NCPD was transferred to private ownership to make it more profitable. The chief of police was replaced by a sales executive who fired half the officers, reduced patrols, and had the force prioritise writing tickets. They even started charging citizens by the minute to make 911 calls. Many of the fired officers were replaced with drone patrols. Naturally, crime rates got worse, and any profitability the organisation gained was short-lived. Before his death, Mayor Rhine had been considering other police options, including using corporate security services. As a result of these issues, the NCPD was extremely undermanned and even found themselves occasionally outgunned by criminals. They straight up refused to operate in the most dangerous areas of the city, notably Pacifica, Santo Domingo, and certain neighbourhoods of Watson. Many of the officers themselves were highly demoralised, in part by the rampant apathy and corruption in their own ranks, going right up to the police commissioner. Of course, the one arm of the force that was never underarmed was MaxTac. Once again, Night City's Cyber Psycho Squad was practically a separate organisation within the NCPD and was very different from other officers. These days, most of them were said to be utterly obsessed with hunting cyber psychos, and according to rumour, the rare psycho they took alive was reconditioned to be a new member of MaxTac. In fact, some said that every member of MaxTac used to be a rampaging cyber psycho. That may have been an exaggeration, but some of them definitely were, and they had the combat cyberware to show for it. MaxTac was sent in whenever a cyber psycho or other sufficiently severe incident occurred. The NCPD ignored any civilian casualties that occurred in their operations, and Internal Affairs declined to perform any investigations into them. And this was Night City in 2077, a city reborn from the ashes, gleaming and modern on the surface but rotten to the core. Corporate power had never been stronger. The gap between rich and poor had never been wider. The streets were filled with desperate people trying to survive, edge runners chasing the next big score, and corpo suits climbing over each other for the next promotion. It was a city where dreams came to die, where legends were born in blood and chrome, where the neon lights never stopped shining and the violence never stopped flowing. It was the city on the edge of tomorrow, just as Richard Knight had envisioned all those years ago. But the tomorrow it stood on the edge of wasn't the bright future he dreamed of. It was a tomorrow of corporate dominance, technological excess, and human suffering. It was a tomorrow where the line between human and machine had blurred beyond recognition, where your worth was measured in eddies and chrome, where you could be anyone you wanted to be, as long as you were willing to pay the price. This is Night City. This is the dark future. This is where our story ends and where countless others begin. In the shadows of the mega buildings, in the neon-lit streets, in the corporate boardrooms and the combat zones, people are living, dying, fighting and dreaming. Some will make it, most won't. But they'll all leave their mark on this city one way or another, because in Night City you can be anything you want to be. You just might not survive long enough to enjoy it. Welcome to Night City. Try not to die on your first day.